Okay, so we have a lot that we want to accomplish in this hour. So I'm going to go ahead and waste not another moment. I want us to be able to engage in rich dialogue, and I have no doubt that we're going to be able to do that today. So I am Dr. Nika White. I serve as your host of Intentional Conversations, our VodCast that we do every week. And I want to wish everyone a happy holidays, happy new year. This is our last VodCast of 2020, but we will be back in 2021 with great additional content. And we look forward to engaging each of this group. I always like to make sure that you are aware of the opportunities that are forthcoming. And so our first podcast of 2021 is going to take place on Friday, January the 8th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. and that's Eastern Standard Time. And we are doing something very special to kick off the year. We're going to have all teammates of NWC, Nika White Consulting, that are going to share our personal stories of our why behind why we are deeply connected to this work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how that impacts the way in which we deliver this work and interact with our clients and others. And so I'm so excited to be joined by my teammates, Anna Viola Goodman, Natasha Poritskova, as well as Lauren Decay, who is not actually featured here, but she is a part of our team. She is a little more than 2.5 weeks in, and she's also joined us today and backstage along with Natasha. So let's go to the next slide, please. And then following January the 8th, we also have another great intentional conversations where Kay Harris is joining us, and she serves as the diversity, equity, and inclusion lead for Milliken. And so we're going to be talking about DEI strategy work and practicing while Black in the midst of social unrest and politically charged climate. And so we look forward to welcoming Kay and having rich dialogue. You'll see here that Anna Viola Goodman is going to be hosting that. I will also still be available and participating, but the year of 2021 is an opportunity for us to allow our teammates at NWC to also show forth their talents and expertise into this space. And so we really look forward to expanding the hosting role among our team. Next slide, please. So it gives me great pleasure to go ahead and tell you about our incredible guest host today. She really needs no introduction because if you have been following this work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and specifically ally work, then her name probably comes to mind immediately. But I do want to give her a formal introduction. Our guest host is Karen Catlin. So after spending 25 years building software products and serving as a vice president of engineering at Macromedia and Adobe, Karen Catlin witnessed a sharp decline in the number of women working in tech, a story we hear often about. Frustrated but galvanized, she knew it was time to switch gears. Today, Karen is a vocal advocate for inclusion, a leadership coach, a keynote speaker, and the author of not one, not two, but 3 books. And I want to tell you the title of those books at this time. The first is Better Allies, Everyday Actions to Create Inclusive, Engaging Workplaces. The second book, The Better Allies, Approach to Hiring, right? And then the third book, Present, A Techie's Guide to Public Speaking. And that is actually co-written with Purnima. We practiced this ahead of time. And I said, no, I'm going to get this right. I'm going to let you pronounce the last name.
Yes, my co-author in that book is Purnima Vijay.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Karen. So much for the practice in advance, right? But I always want to make sure that at least we're getting people's names correct. And so I certainly needed to punt that to you. So thank you, Karen. So why don't you just share with this audience a bit more about who you are and your story? Specifically, I know that we've given you, we've shared your accolades and your credentials, but I always like to tell people to share their story and how in which you became such an advocate for inclusive workplaces and specifically to write Better Allies.
Yes, thank you. And first of all, it's an honor and pleasure to be joining you today. So thank you so much for having me on the podcast. And the interesting thing is I did not set out to write any of these books and certainly did not set out to become an advocate for inclusive workplaces and to be talking about this on stages around the world. It all started when I was working in tech. You mentioned I worked in tech for 25 years. I started out writing code for a living, and over time I moved into leadership roles. Most recently, I was a VP of engineering at Adobe. And during that 25 years, I noticed a decline happening in gender diversity in the tech industry, which a lot of people don't realize, but there used to be more women getting computer science degrees, back when I started my career, and it did drop off over the years. So while I was still at Adobe as the most senior woman on the engineering side, I felt I had a role to play, a role to be an advocate for women at my company. And so I started our women's employee resource group. I started mentoring a lot of women and basically just looking out for women in the various meetings that I was, just interacting with and making sure that they were having a fair shot at getting ahead, growing their career. And Nika, I have to tell you, I loved doing that work so much, and a little bit less so my VP of engineering work. And so over time, I decided I needed to do a pivot to being able to help women across tech grow their careers. So I started a leadership coaching practice about 8 years ago. But I soon realized I had this big problem. And the problem wasn't with my clients, who are all amazing. The problem was that they were all working in tech companies where the closer you got to the C-suite, to the CEO, just the maler and paler it got. And I'll share, with all due respect to anyone who's male and or pale who's joined me today, that's just what the demographics are like. So this is not about shaming and blaming. That's just stating the facts. So at that point, I realized to truly help my coaching clients, I needed to make all of tech more inclusive. Big job, right? One person over here, big job. Yeah. But the first thing you do when you want to change the world these days is you start a Twitter handle. So I started a Twitter handle called Better Allies, @BetterAllies. And my goal of this Twitter handle was to share these simple, everyday actions anyone could take to be more inclusive. Because I really heard from so many people like, well, I care about this topic. I want to be more inclusive. I care about diversity at work, but what am I supposed to do? So a lot of people are feeling that, right? You probably hear that from in the work that you do from clients. I also was hearing from people like, I tried to do something and got my virtual hand slapped. I did the wrong thing, so I just don't get involved with those conversations anymore. You heard that too?
I have, absolutely. Yeah.
So my goal was to share just simple things people could do, not big top-down DEI strategies for the company, but things they could do in the meetings they were attending, the conversations they were having, the work that they were doing on a day-to-day basis. One example of a tweet would be, I pledge to notice when an interruption happens in a meeting and redirect the conversation back to the person who was interrupted with a simple, I'd like to hear Natasha finish her thought, like just a respectful redirection. So I started tweeting, focusing on gender diversity initially, how to support women at work. And I soon realized, oh my gosh, this space is so much more than I thought initially, in that people from other underrepresented groups have it, just as bad, if not worse, than women in the workplace. Start focusing on how to be an ally to people from all underrepresented groups based on race, ethnicity, age, abilities, sexual orientation and identity, college graduation status or not, and so forth. So I started expanding my work on this little Twitter handle that was kind of like the little engine that could, and sharing a few things here and there. But the surprising thing is I then started getting speaking engagements based on an anonymous Twitter handle. And I would get one of these requests like, hey, does anyone from the Better Allies Initiative do any public speaking? Okay, you're laughing because initiative, right?
You're thinking the Better Allies Initiative? Oh, that's me.
Me doing a couple tweets a day. This is not an initiative. But I wanted to stay anonymous because I think it was a little more powerful. I think a lot of people thought it was a man tweeting these things because it was all first person. I'm going to do this differently. So I would message the person back who was asking about speaking, and I'd say, well, yes, one of our contributors does some public speaking, and we'll put you in touch with her. Then I'd go over to my personal Twitter account, get in touch with them, and say, I'm Karen Catlin. I contribute to Better Allies, and I love public speaking. What do you have in mind? So I started speaking about this topic. Every time I spoke at a corporate event, a conference, someone would ask, hey, Karen, do you have a book? Because we want more of this. And for a few years, I kept saying, no, I don't have a book. I need to write that book. I don't. So I finally have written the book. In fact, 2 books, as you kindly mentioned in your introduction. Okay, so that's the backstory of how I came to even be here with you today.
Well, we love that backstory. Thanks so much for sharing it with us, Karen. And I think that what I love about your work, and I'm sure this is why others gravitate to it as well, is that it's practical. It is not mysterious. You know, sometimes people say it's not enough just to transfer knowledge. I need for you to walk me through how to do this, how to put this into practice. And that's what I think is so rich about the information that you share. It's just so practical. We can walk away and then immediately begin to apply those ally skills to the environments in which we belong. And so I love that. So I don't want to assume, we have a really large audience today, I don't want to assume that everyone understands what we mean when we talk about ally and allyship. And so we've often talked about it on Intentional Conversations, but again, we may have some newcomers today. And so I want you to define what allyship and what an ally is for this audience, okay?
Sure. I look at it as someone who has some level of privilege, which we often think of as white men in the workplace, but not necessarily. So someone who has some level of privilege who can open a career door, disrupt some non-inclusive behavior, use their position of privilege to amplify and advocate for another person in the workplace. And ideally do that in a way that isn't just helping one person, but is driving some systemic change at the same time so that all boats rise with the tide, so to speak.
Right, absolutely. And I often like to amplify the fact that allyship at bare minimum is about action, right? Sometimes people will perceive that if I just, vocalize that I stand in solidarity with certain groups that are oppressed, that's enough. And I think that's also why the word accomplice oftentimes finds itself into the conversation. When you think about being an accomplice, there's a risk involved in that, but it's a risk to where the individual has clearly reached the conclusion that it's worth it. I need to do this. This is important. And that's where the humanity aspect comes in. And I always say that we have to choose courage over comfort. So I love making sure that this audience is keenly aware that at bare minimum, we're talking about action, right?
Yes. Action. Yeah. Action. Don't just sit back. And by the way, there's no ally cookie, ally badge. You don't just get to say, I'm an ally. It's an active verb. Yes.
Oh, absolutely. And it's also one of those labels and titles that we shouldn't be assigning to ourselves. We need that the people in which we're allying for, that we're standing, again, and sacrificing for, to help them to have better, more inclusive, equitable opportunities, that we need to earn that title from them, those marginalized groups. And so I always like to amplify that as well. So you mentioned privilege as you were defining allyship, and I want us to unpack that as well, because I too believe that in order for us to be effective allies, we have to recognize and acknowledge our sources of power and privilege, because that's where we can leverage influence to be able to create opportunities that allows, again, a rising tide lifts all boats, allows all individuals to be able to emerge stronger. And so talk about just the relationship to bias and privilege a little bit deeper to the work of allyship.
Yes. So as I was doing research for my book, starting to understand more and more about the ways privilege shows up, I realized 2 things. First is privilege, when it's pointed out, often causes us to get defensive because we assume, oh, someone's saying I have privilege. It sounds like I've been lazy. I haven't had to work hard to, for what I have today professionally or personally. And so we do get defensive, and I've been there myself. But really, privilege is simply a benefit that is given to people of a certain group, a certain social group. And in our society today, that's based on gender, the color of our skin, the religion we have, if that's visible, and other visible traits. So that's one thing I learned, is that defensiveness is very natural and can happen, but it shouldn't be. It's not. It is simply an unearned advantage that we get based on certain social settings, right? And then I started having conversations with people and realizing how many different ways privilege can show up or be present, especially in the workplace. People have probably heard of privilege walks and things like that, where privilege is pointed out as you take steps forward or backwards based on your personal situation. And what I wanted to do for my readers was put together a list of 50 ways. It turned out to be 50. I didn't know how many I'd come up with, but it turned out to be 50 ways you might have privilege in the workplace. And there are things, sure, it's like first two are you are white, you are male. But it goes deeper than that. It gets into economic privilege. I remember talking to a woman who mentioned that she is a caregiver for an adult sister who has some disabilities. She said, I don't have any spare time, but I certainly don't have extra money to be spending on after work kind of grabbing dinner or drinks or going on that fun whitewater rafting adventure on a Saturday with the team that's not company sanctioned or sponsored. She said, I just don't have that money. So it gets deeper. And then things like citizenship status here in our country, in the United States. If you have citizenship or a green card, you have a lot more privilege than someone who's on a company-sponsored work visa, right? You can take more risks with your career. You can sign up for things that you can say things out loud that maybe other people would be like, I'm just staying down behind the scenes. I don't want to cause any ripples, right? So there's a lot of ways to have privilege. By any chance, did you take a look at that list of 50 ways? Are you familiar? Any surprises or any comments on it?
So Karen, you know that I follow your work. I'm a big fan. And so absolutely, I pay attention to every bit of content that you put out there. And so, yes, I actually have it in my hand right now, 50 potential privileges in the workplace. And this list is so rich. And I am sure that if we were to sit down and continue to keep thinking, there's probably another 50 that would occur. But what I love about it is that, again, the practicality of it. Sometimes we don't know how in which we are coming from a place of privilege. And so just seeing it in writing, it certainly gives each of us pause, at least it should, to reflect on what are my sources of power and privilege. There are a couple that I highlighted, and I would like to, with your permission, just kind of get you to react to them. So one of which is you feel welcome and valued on group projects. And so, I think about a lot of team structures within work environments and who gets assigned to the high visible projects and who's always tapped over and over again. And then when you finally get tapped, especially if you are maybe someone from underrepresented populations, how do you feel once you enter into that environment? Do you feel like you have to conform to the mainstream way of thinking? Or do you have that psychological safety to be able to bring your whole self and to have a difference of opinion and perspective? So, sometimes we don't realize that, just being tapped. And so I wanted to get you to respond to that.
Yes, I agree with everything you're saying. In fact, I also will add that someone who's from an underrepresented group, having that first, walking into that room, whether it's virtual or in person, for that first time to that new work group or meeting with a big client that they're going to be pitching to or whatever that might look like, that first time, not only are they thinking all of the things you just said, can I show up as my true authentic self? Is it safe for me to bring alternative perspectives and all of that, whatever. You have to realize that is causing them a lot of churn in their head that prevents them from maybe even showing up as their best self in the moment. It's what happens also, frankly, with introverts who are thinking like, can I speak now? Did I just say something that offended someone? Did I say the right thing just then? I'm an introvert, so I know this really well, but we're processing behind the scenes, and that causes us not to stay present in the moment. So it's a huge thing that I think we need to recognize as a source of privilege when we don't actually experience that ourselves.
Yeah. The reason I think that I highlighted that one and stood out to me is because it just reminded me of that privilege is often invisible to those who have it, And so if your experience is always being able to join a team or an organization or be in an environment to where you feel immediately that sense of belonging and connection and valued and accepted, that is a place of privilege, but just know that that is unique to you. Certainly there could be others that have that same experience, but if you were to really inventory a group of diverse constituents, particularly those that are part of marginalized, oppressed, underrepresented populations, I guarantee you that their lived experience is going to be vastly different. Here's another one. Here's another one that stood out, and I think this is so relevant to the climate we're in right now with the global pandemic. You have stable housing.
Yes. I know, that stable housing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think about all of the kids who are having to navigate their, academics in a home that may not be safe, or even a spouse or a partner that may be in an environment that's not really healthy. And I mean, it's just, that's hard. That's hard to even consider. So I think that's why that one gave me pause when I thought about the fact that we all are spending so much time now. I don't want to use the word confined to our homes, but definitely we're limited in our, our comings and goings. And so, yeah, that's
and I
to
want to
me.
point out, Nika, that Natasha shared the link to the 50 ways you might have privilege in the workplace in the chat. So people who are listening, if you want to check that out, it's a free PDF download on my website. So you can check it out there.
And it is so worth it. I see that. Yes. So Natasha and Lauren behind the scenes are making sure that we have our resources. And so, yes, thank you to those colleagues who are sharing that. But you're going to want to download this because it is so valuable. Here's one more, and then we'll move on. And this one was a surprise to me. So I want to get you to help educate me on why this is a place of privilege and really what's not being said in this statement. Your manager maintains eye contact when speaking to you.
Yes. So this came from a number of stories, anecdotes that I heard from women who worked in tech. That was my initial focus, even though I think my work is applicable to other industries. But working in tech where they'd have a one-on-one or even a group meeting, and the manager would have eye contact with the men around the table, but not with them. It could be a cultural discomfort kind of thing. But what happens when you're on the receiving end of that is that the manager, you're feeling like, why can't that person look at me? What's wrong with me? Why can't they show me respect by looking me in the eye instead of just like looking at the floor or to the other people around the table and not me as an equal peer to everyone else? So, yeah.
Or maybe it sends the message that I make them uncomfortable, and could that discomfort be because I'm different from them?
Right.
It's a multitude of reasons that I think someone could certainly see someone not maintaining eye contact as somewhat of an oppressive, behavior. And so, no, I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm glad you connected the loop for me. And so, we talked a moment ago about the fact that we're in this global pandemic, which is no surprise to any of us. We're living it every single day. But is it difficult to be an ally in this virtual climate that we're in right now? And if it's not, what are some tips for this broader audience as to how to do that effectively when we don't necessarily have equal number of opportunities that we had prior to COVID to have that connection?
I know so much is harder about virtual, but you know what? And I'm such an optimist, glasses half full kind of person. I also think there are things that are easier in a virtual environment in terms of being a better ally. One is that because we're all on virtual, conference systems, whatever we're using, Zoom or other things, our names are right on the screen. And what that means is it's easier for people to refer to someone by their name and not get perhaps the only two Asian women confused with each other, or the two Black guys that are on the team, swapping their names. Right. That often happens. It's a well-documented phenomenon that the two of any underrepresented group often get confused for each other. So it's so much easier now. We're not making that mistake because people's names are actually in front of them. Also, a best practice is to put your pronouns alongside your name. And I don't think I did that today. This is a new platform that I'm on, so it's not part of my profile. But on my Zoom account, I have she, her as my pronouns in parentheses right after my name. Right. And by normalizing that sharing of pronouns, it makes it easier for anyone who has a pronoun that maybe is, not expected, such as I prefer they as a pronoun. It's easier for everyone to be sharing their pronouns when it's normalized and everyone's doing it. And then, of course, it's this nice reminder when we are actually talking about someone or to them, and then we want to use a pronoun, which one to use. Third thing I'll just mention about what I think is easier about being an ally in a virtual environment is when we are in meetings, we are all online. And what that means is there is always a back channel. There's a back channel that you can reach out to someone and say, hey, did you notice you're doing a lot of talking in this meeting? How about in the second half of the meeting, we both listen more and talk less, for example, to someone who might be doing a lot of interruptions and not even realizing it. So there's just a few thoughts about that.
Yeah. I use the direct messaging features in a lot of our Zoom meetings and things of that nature to communicate with my colleagues, but I never saw it as a way to also be able to practice allyship. I never saw it in that light, but you're so right. Again, you're bringing so much practicality to this work that for some people feels quite daunting and like a big undertaking, but there's some practical things we can do every day. So in your book, you have a whole chapter about knights riding in to save the day versus allies. And so I want you to unpack that for us, because I think many of us have heard about the savior mentality and the implications of that, but let's unpack that a little bit further.
Yes, the savior mentality. I am the knight riding in on my white stallion to save the damsel in distress from some potential problem. And really, that's making it all about the knight in shining armor. How awesome I am. I'm riding in to save this person. And while I never want to communicate to someone like, don't save the one person in the moment when you can actually act as an ally, I want to encourage people to look for systemic change they can have so that, I mentioned this earlier, the workplace gets better for everyone. All boats rise with the tide, so to speak. So let me give a practical example of what this might look like. And this happened for a client of mine, a coaching client. She was reviewing the annual salaries. It was that time of the year to do salary adjustments for her team. And she noticed that one woman was severely underpaid compared to her peers. So what's the knight action in this case? The knight action is with, very quick little edit to the spreadsheet. She could have adjusted that one person's salary. Super easy. She could do it. She could even claim, some success with maybe her manager, like, I'm so awesome because I noticed this and I fixed it, if she was even going to do that. But better, and this is what she did, is she actually worked with the people department, HR, and said, I noticed this one discrepancy. We may have a problem. So we should really do a salary review of everyone at the company and look for discrepancies. And and I appreciate this. As a result of this, she found that not only there were women who were underpaid, but there were a handful of men who were severely underpaid. And in sort of a Ruth Bader Ginsburg approach to life is you don't just help. You apply equity to everybody. So those men also got raises in this situation, which I appreciate.
Yeah, no, I as well. I love that story. That's a good one. Okay, so I want you to tell us about a time when someone acted as your ally, especially when I think about all the stories you've shared where being a woman in the tech industry. So I'm sure there may be some of those opportunities that inspires your work today. So tell us about a time when someone was an ally for you.
Yes, there's so many stories. My favorite one to share is, I'll share this one. My favorite one is when I joined Adobe. I joined Adobe as a senior member of the engineering staff. And I remember being in an engineering leadership meeting, maybe with about 40 people. And I heard my boss, who was a senior vice president, highly respected across the organization, I heard him say, well, what I learned from is the following. Okay. He then went on to summarize something I had shared with him in a one-on-one, maybe the previous week or so. But what he did, and this is an example of that easy ally action. By saying he learned something from me, this new person just joined his team, he gave me this signal boost. He advocated for me in the moment. He endorsed my perspective in front of all my peers, okay? And frankly, he made me feel great when it came right down to it. So I always appreciate that. Of course, he would not say he was acting as an ally. He just I was just doing my job. And that's the beauty of this all. But he made me feel great in the moment. And I'm sure that setup helped me be more successful initially at the company, just being able to network with my peers, getting to know them, getting to earn their respect. He did it for me in the moment.
I love that. I absolutely love that. So let that inspire each of you that are part of today's community. Again, it doesn't take some type of well thought out strategic plan to be an ally. Sometimes they're just simple, practical things we can do every day while we're in the moment. And so I love that. So I want to acknowledge, because I haven't done this yet, I want to acknowledge our live Facebook audience that's joining us today as well. If you have any comments, certainly feel free to place them into the chat area. Our backstage team, or taking notes of all of that commentary, and we're bringing it into this Hop-In experience. And for those that are joining with us live on Hop-In, certainly continue to let the chatter keep flowing. Lots of great comments that are happening right now into the chat room. And if you have questions, also make sure that you are presenting those. We will make sure that we have time at the end to address those questions. So here's what I want to do next. You have so much great advice and counsel for people who find themselves in a situation where they're looking to be an effective ally. And so I have some scenarios that I want to run by you today. And the first one is actually a real scenario that came to our team yesterday evening from one of our clients. And I will protect the anonymity of the client by just giving some generalizations of the situation. But I'm going to share this with you, and then I want you just to respond to it to help us to be able to navigate how in which they can address the situation. So one of our anchor account teams were recently in an uncomfortable meeting with a client. This is the client's note to us. The client asked for an edit, and when delivering the direction and feedback, used some stereotypical borderline racist remarks regarding one of the men in the photo. Alarms went off for the team. It should be noted that the team values this client and his partnership, but his remarks have certainly made people on the team uncomfortable. Do you have recommendations for, and here are the two questions, how to best approach the team that had this experience to ensure their comfort? So how to ally for this team. And then two, how to deliver feedback to the client. And I will point out that I appreciate the question was not whether or not to, but how to deliver the feedback. So I wanted to touch base there.
This is,
okay, so
this is a great scenario. And here's the thing, like the power dynamic at play here is tricky. This is from someone who wants to give feedback to someone who pays their bills, who's a client of theirs, right? Yes. So there's a power dynamic, and it's similar to the power dynamic we might have in a workplace where, I don't want to point out, a couple levels up that person just said something offensive. It's hard. Like, is that a career limiting move, so to speak? So I get it. Yet here's the thing. When we don't say something, we become complicit. Complicit meaning that we are in agreement, that we're allowing that offensive remark to just land and to stay there. And so when we don't say something, we don't speak up, we become complicit. In my book, I talk about this being, I'm a bystander, assuming someone else will give her the feedback, them the feedback. That's a bystander kind of thing. Someone else is going to give them the feedback. Instead, we need to be the upstander for what we know is right, even in these dynamics where it's a little bit tricky. I do believe there's a way to give feedback that's not blaming and shaming. I believe there's a way to give feedback that is it's substantial, it's meaningful, it's respectful. And so I would encourage this team to think about how, ideally they would have done it in the moment. It's hard to now go back, but in the moment, if it happens again, I encourage them to say something like, potentially even, addressing the moment with, I didn't appreciate how you referred to that person. A better way to describe your feedback, if you don't mind me summarizing, is the following, and use more respectful language, like model the language that would be more respectful. Again, without causing the shaming and blaming that would really upset that power dynamic.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think there's a lot of merit into finding ways through the relationship to keep that influence intact so that you can potentially change the likelihood of the behavior. Because I often say that if you meet aggression with aggression, then the conversation is going to end, right? And then that's certainly not going to move towards any type of change. And so, ultimately the goal here is not to walk away. You want to make sure that you're trying to maintain, because I think that certainly the relationship relationship probably is valuable, and the client communicated that. But then you also want to make sure you're protecting your team and that you are, again, influencing how in which those interactions are occurring. So I appreciate that. Chris placed into the chat, and I have to just repeat this because I think it's such a great statement. Integrity has a cost, and it is always worth it. Yes, that's so strong. Thank you, Chris. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, so make sure you're continuing to use the chat to place maybe your questions. In just a second, we will transition to maybe your questions or scenarios that we want Karen to respond to. I'm going to give you a couple other scenarios, okay? Okay, so I'm in a virtual meeting and I notice someone is having trouble getting a word in. One person in particular keeps talking over them. I'm an ally. What do I do? What can I do in this situation from an ally perspective?
In my book, and other people call this the man-terruption, just because it's typically a man. It's just more culturally acceptable, I think, for men to interrupt women than the other way around. But regardless of who is doing the interruption, it is something that's not inclusive. And people over time just step back from the conversations. Like, why do I even bother showing up to this meeting? Because I can never speak. So it is important to say something. And as I mentioned, I think at the very beginning of our conversation, like a simple, respectful, I'd like to hear Natasha finish her thought. If she is the person who's being interrupted, can go a long way. Or using the chat, the online back channel chat, to message that person and say, there are other people who have joined that I think we should hear from. Let's talk less in the second half of the meeting. Great way to do that. Yeah.
No, I love it. I also will add amplification. I think that if one person's comment, now someone else is being credited for it, we need to make sure that we're comfortable stepping in and amplifying so that we redirect the credit back to the person who really is deserving of it. You mentioned certainly the dynamics between men and women. Obviously, you see a lot of interruptions, but I'm also hearing a lot about a lot of younger professionals, millennials in the workplace are being talked over as well and interrupted. So I think there are many audiences that probably could gain value from some of those tips. Okay, so here's another scenario for you, Karen. I'm frequently the only woman in the room. And once again, I'm asked to take the minutes or to schedule a follow-up meeting or plan a fun activity for our offsite.
Office housework.
Housework.
That is what it is. In fact, if people who have joined us live want to share in the chat any other examples of office housework that they have seen, you listed taking the minutes for the meeting or planning a fun activity for an offsite or a virtual happy hour. Yeah, these things are all office housework if they aren't part of your job. Years ago, I was a program manager, project manager, and my job was to run effective meetings, take notes, communicate the results, track action items, to-dos, all of that. That was part of my job. It's not office housework then. When it's not part of your job, though, and you're asked to do it, it's this housework that basically puts you in a subservient role to everyone else around the table, to your peers on the team. You're in service of other people. And frankly, when we might be taking the notes at a meeting, we are kind of a step behind the conversation, trying to track it versus contribute to it. So we almost like we're not set up for success to really show up with our best self and to make maybe those killer points we could be making in a meeting. So as an ally, if you notice someone is always the one woman, and by the way, there's research that shows women of color get tasked with even more housework than women. Women get tasked with a lot, but women of color get tasked with even more. When you see that happening, a best practice is to set up a rotation. Hey, this standing meeting is going to happen every month. Let's set up a rotation for who is going to be taking the notes, tracking action items, doing timekeeping, whatever that might be. Or offer to just take those notes yourself in the moment. Like
Exactly. Right. And let me say this with all due respect, especially if you're the white male senior leader in the room, right?
Show of solidarity, yes. And allyship, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah, so some of the examples of other housework that's coming up into the chat would be ordering lunch, cleaning up the kitchen, literally, they said, especially, or maybe cleaning up the conference room after a meeting, planning the holiday parties or the happy hours, Making the coffee, yes, Chris, or the tea. We have coffee and tea drinkers. Yeah, and someone commented that HR seems to often be considered the party planners. And yeah, so lots of other examples of office housework. Okay, so I'm going to give you maybe a couple more, and then we're going to shift to the audience questions. So a coworker comes out as trans, and another coworker assumes that you are cis and starts complaining to you privately about how ridiculous it is to expect everyone to start using your coworker's new name and pronouns. How can you be an ally in this particular scenario?
Oh my gosh, I'm laughing because I'm like, really, really, but I'm sure it does happen. So
yes,
here's one of those situations, and I just learned this phrase from a webinar I attended last week, was get curious, not furious. Like, I would be furious that someone was like so privileged they couldn't like figure out how to use a new name for somebody. Like, really, that's my initial reaction, was to get a little furious. But instead, I think getting curious is really good. Getting curious in terms of just asking, what about it is ridiculous? Tell me more. Get them to confront their bias, right? It's either going to come up and you're going to have a discussion about it, or they're going to be like, oh, forget it, like, because they don't want to go there. So getting curious, not furious. Tell me more about why you're feeling that way. Really trying to understand their perspective can go a long way in this situation, as well as others where there's something biased happening, something happening in the background that you're like, I think that's biased. Get curious, not furious.
No, I love that. Get curious, not furious. And by the way, I want to make sure that I clarify. I use the word cis, and I don't want to assume that everyone in this audience knows what cis is, but it's when you identify as the gender in which you were assigned at birth. And so I wanted to put that clarification out there. So yeah, get curious and not furious. I love that. There's something so powerful about authentic curiosity. I think that it shows forth our desire to not just to be complicit about what we feel like we know, but to want to learn more. And I often say that cultural competence can gain us a lot of knowledge, right? It's just cultural competence. And so I appreciate that. Okay, one more, then I'll shift to the audience. I'm discussing Black Lives Matter with a group of colleagues, and one of them chimes in with all lives matter and makes it about her now and how all women have it bad.
This is such a good scenario. This is one of those situations where you need to stand up to it. Standing up to it might look like this. It's like, yeah, I agree that women have it bad in the workplace. You can agree with them on that point. I agree that women have it bad in the workplace, yet it's really important to focus on our Black colleagues, because they have been experiencing situations and systemic oppression for hundreds of years in our country. And this is the time that we really need to understand how their experience is different than others and figure out what we can do about it. So again, I call that kind of a gentle reminder of how important the topic is. But you can find some common ground there. Yeah, I agree, women have it hard in the workplace, but this is really the time to be focusing on our Black colleagues.
No, I appreciate that. And I will tell you, this is a very live and real conversation that's happening, at least with our world, is some of the conversations with those that we have relationships with weekly. And specifically, I think that what is happening is that there are certain populations of people, particularly those that are maybe part of the LGBTQ plus community, that they feel threatened by this pronounced attention to the racial inequities, right, that have been persistent for 400 plus years and continue to show forth in every system without exception. But they almost feel as though the conversation is so focused there that they're going to be left out. You know, how are we prioritizing the race conversation without also giving an equal level of attention to some of these other demographics that also find themselves oppressed and marginalized? And so I don't know if you've been having some of those conversations, but I know we certainly have. And
yes,
just want to get you to react to that.
In fact, I was doing a interview for another client earlier this week. And he said that he was having a conversation with someone a white man who's like, with all this conversation focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, I feel my career is being limited. And my snarky, like, initial thought was like, get over it. You've had it easy your whole life. You have no idea how easy your life has been compared to someone who is, for example, a Black woman in the same workplace. So that was my first reaction, was like, get over it. But a more respectful approach that would be productive, I'll call it, could be, again, getting curious. It's like, well, tell me more about how you feel your career is being limited. What is that? How is that showing up? What is it? What's happening?
Yeah.
And really, at the end of the day, if we think of a successful business or organization as a pie, with diversity, equity, and inclusion, when we have an inclusive workplace where everyone's doing their best work and thriving, that pie is just getting bigger. The opportunities are bigger, the business is growing, the work, frankly, is easier because everyone is just thriving and just doing wonderful stuff. And more people want to join, so it's easier to hire because the word gets out what a wonderful culture this is. And so the pie just keeps getting bigger. So even if you feel like you're sliced, you're sharing that pie with more people, your overall slice is getting bigger as well because that pie is getting bigger. So that's how I really like to think of this. It's a multiplier kind of mindset versus a limitation mindset.
Right. Oh, absolutely. It's not an either or, it's a both and. And so we have to help people to conclude that this is not about some type of competition or something being, or opportunities that are being diminished for you, and so I appreciate that. You've mentioned twice now 3 of my favorite words, especially as a tool to use when you're engaging in people, especially around these types of delicate conversations, and that is tell me more. I love that. It is such this non-invasive way of keeping the conversation going and without, again, the guilting, blaming, or shaming. But once you say to someone, especially if you're a witness to, or maybe the victim of some type of microaggression, micro inequity, tell me more about that. I want to understand your line of thinking. As they begin to engage and tell you more, and they listen to themselves talk, I have found that more times than not, they are able to conclude on their own that, oh my goodness, what I'm saying is not warranted. It's steeped and rooted in some type of maybe bigotry or prejudice. It's biased, and sometimes it can correct itself. And so I just wanted to amplify that as a tool for this community.
And
tell
Nika,
me more. Those 3
use
words.
That technique as I learn about how to be a better ally. I'm very, I have a weekly newsletter. I send stuff out all the time. I'm active on Twitter. I'm speaking a lot. I'm answering questions. I make mistakes, or I get called out on certain things. And when that happens, I get curious, not furious. And that whole approach of, wait, tell me more. I want to understand this. I want to understand why you pointed this out. I want to do some research myself. That's certainly important. I don't want someone to have to educate me on everything, but understanding someone's point of view really has helped me become a better ally. This whole thing's a journey. We're all on this journey to be better allies. We are never going to be done because we can't possibly understand the perspective of people who are different from us, like their real life experiences. So we have to continue being curious, learning more, getting better on this journey to be better allies.
So well stated. And also the recognition that we're going to make mistakes, right? It's not about when or if, it's about when. And when you make a mistake, you apologize, you correct yourself, you move on. But the truest form of a sincere apology is change behavior. You can't continue to fall into this trap where you're repeating those patterns over and over again. But I always like to amplify that because, again, I think that so many of us can find ourselves in a position where we will just stay in a bubble. We won't say anything. We won't do anything because we're just so afraid. We're so afraid we're going to get it wrong, but that's not the position that we need to be in from an allyship perspective. We need to be willing to take those risks and to realize that we're going to maybe get it wrong, but that's okay. That's okay. Our intent is pure. And so we have to make sure that the impact is not creating these lingering negative implications, though, and that requires us fixing it. Okay. So I want to go to a couple questions that have been presented. So this question comes from Val. I have a scenario question similar to the team having to give feedback to the client. In this scenario, the protagonist is a white American working abroad and the only foreigner in a team of white Western European coworkers who are all of the same nationality. One of the coworkers makes a racist comment and no other member of the team seems to find it problematic. Would anything change about how to approach this?
Oh, I don't think so. I still want that person to be empowered to speak up. This is a situation that even if no one present is offended by the statement, the joke, the comment, it still is important to stand up for what you believe in and push back. This doesn't even have to happen in a different country. It could be a group of men, someone saying, something, an off-color remark about one of their coworkers who's a woman. Even if she's not in earshot, someone should say something, right? So I do think that you still should say something. Yeah, don't be a bystander.
Yeah, it's interesting in that I often get questions too around when is the right time to address these situations, because we also have said multiple times you don't want to guilt, shame, or blame. And so sometimes we have the repercussions of that if we're right in the moment. And I always tell people from my vantage point, and I want to hear your thoughts too, Karen, it's all circumstantial. I think that we each have to be discerning about the timing. If you are in a pretty significant size meeting and there are a lot of people who are witness to this and it's pretty egregious, then you're going to want to address it then and there, because no one necessarily is going to be aware that after the fact you pull that person aside and have a one-on-one. And so I'm not saying there's a right or a wrong, but I think that we all have to just be really mindful and practice good situational awareness and be discerning about, is this the right time or can this be solved with the one-to-one? And that there's not always a one-size-fits-all approach there. So I want to go to the next question. This comes from Marcel. Hi, Marcel. Thanks for joining us today. I recently had a conversation with a coworker who was talking about how, because of her rural Southern accent, she often feels uncomfortable speaking up at meetings since people tend to laugh, assume she's joking, or take her less seriously because of how she talks. I want to figure out how I can support her and move away from elitism and accents. That's really good.
A time to really think about how you can look for everyday ways of sponsorship. So when that colleague speaks up in a meeting, amplify what she just said. Say, I really like so-and-so's, Sue, I'll make up a name. I really like Sue's idea, and here is how my department can contribute to the success or the next steps. Like, give her some, build some credibility for her that she might not otherwise be receiving because of this bias against her accent. Yeah.
Yeah. It reminds me of oftentimes when we do unconscious bias training, we like to refer to it in the positive as conscious inclusion training. But we have this exercise called First Thoughts, where we will invite audience members to, through a word cloud, because these days, of course, everything is all virtual, right? But they are using a polling tool to provide their first thoughts, their first reactions about certain populations of people. And one of the groups oftentimes would be Southerners, or maybe it could be Northerners. But just recently, we had the Southerners category, and a lot of people in that environment, as we unpack the words that were coming forth, they took offense to it. But it was a great teachable moment, because obviously the point of the exercise was to get people to realize that we all have biases, right? It doesn't make us bad people. It makes us human. Doesn't mean that we explicitly endorse these thoughts about this population of people. They're just part of our records that have been stored for quite some time. But it does bring up this dynamic that we never realized, how in which even what we perceive as an innocent joke, could be flirting with someone really feeling compromised and not feeling like they can show up at their best selves. So here we have this individual who is not speaking up. So the perception could be that maybe she's not confident, that perhaps she's not competent, which means she could be looked over for opportunities. It's a domino effect. And that's what I wanted to amplify with this. We may think it's, such a simple thing, get over it, it's not that big of a deal, but there's a domino effect here that we cannot ignore. And so you're shaking your head. I feel like you may want to jump in and share some thoughts too about that.
Plus 100 on everything you're saying. Yes, that domino effect. And so I'll just share one more thing that you could do for someone who you see is on the receiving end of bias like this is actually spend some time getting to know their work. Doesn't even take that much time, but set up a one-on-one and say, I'd like to better understand the work you're doing, your quarterly goals, what's important, like what do you want to be doing for your career? And then look for opportunities to speak about their work when they aren't even around, when they're not even in that room. Speak about and sing their praises. Get to know their work so you can actually do that and have it be very genuine. So that's another way of providing some sponsorship. I noticed earlier in this webinar, Natasha shared a link to an article, an interview I did with Forbes magazine, and I outlined exactly some things that people can do in kind of an everyday way to sponsor their coworkers from underrepresented groups. So folks, go take a look at that afterwards, and you might get some ideas of how to act in the moment.
I love it. Thank you so much for amplifying that. And the team also just reposted it once again so that you don't have to dig through all of the chat. And by the way, when we send our follow-up, not only will you have a replay of this entire conversation with Karen, but also we will include some takeaways as well as some of these resources that have been linked into the chat. And many of our audience today has been sharing some resources as well. So we so appreciate all of that. So we're getting close to the top of the hour, and we've talked about a lot, and this conversation could continue just to flow. And I've really enjoyed having you here today, Karen. My last question, which I like to ask all of our guest co-hosts, is we've talked about a lot, but if there's something else that you feel really passionate about right now that maybe you're connected with, or from a messaging perspective you want to amplify, well,
thank you.
I want to give you that chance now to share it with this audience.
I am going to repeat myself in terms of being an ally is a journey. That is the final thing, the final message I want to share with everyone. And it's a journey I am on myself. I do learn so much every week. And I do have a weekly newsletter where I share the 5 things I've learned during the course of the week on how to be a better ally. And it may be based on things that have come out in the news, such as the recent Wall Street Journal article or op-ed about why Dr. Jill Biden should not use her hard-earned title of doctor. That's an example of a piece of news that I can then discuss briefly and talk about how to act as an ally, which is basically, if any, the teaser on this newsletter hasn't come out yet, but the teaser, spoiler alert, is use someone's hard-earned honorific, such as Dr. Nika White, for example. So I learn all the time. I share these learnings in my newsletter. And if people want to join me on this journey to be a better ally, please go to my website, betterallies.com, and sign up for my newsletter. It's free. And I also have a purchase page with all the ways that you can buy my book, whether that's on Amazon or through independent bookstores and so forth.
We're going to make sure that we link all of that, not only into the chat, but also into our follow-up communication. And I guarantee you will be so much more informed if you were to follow Karen and all of the resources that she's shared. Such rich information. I also follow you on Instagram. And again, I love just the practical, quick, simple tidbits that you share quite frequently. But I often share with people that when they say yes to our invitation, it makes us feel valued, seen, and heard. And that is a gift. And so we are so grateful for your time, your wisdom, your knowledge, and just your ability to share with us some practical information that we know is going to be useful to each of us in our respective roles. And so thank you so much, Karen. We wish you best of luck with all of the continued success that you're realizing, and look forward to remaining in touch with you in the future. So thank you so much. Thank you to each of you that have joined us today for Intentional Conversations VodCast. We have really enjoyed it. We will not be here the next 2 Fridays because they are holidays, and we hope that each of you will have happy Hanukkah, happy Kwanzaa, Merry Christmas, happy holidays, but just have a joyous time over these next few weeks with all of those that you love. And we look forward to seeing you on January the 8th for the first Intentional Conversation podcast of 2021. Thank you all so much. Take care. Thanks again, Karen.